said to have carved an inscription on his tomb setting forth how the god had been killed by the python and buried under the tripod. The great gods of Egypt themselves were not exempt from the common lot. They too grew old and died. But when at a later time the discovery of the art of embalming gave a new lease of life to the souls of the dead by preserving their bodies for an indefinite time from corruption, the deities were permitted to share the benefit of an invention which held out to gods as well as to men a reasonable hope of immortality. Every province then had the tomb and mummy of its dead god. The mummy of Osiris was to be seen at Mendes. Thinis boasted of the mummy of Anhuri, and Heliopolis rejoiced in the possession of that of Tumu. The high gods of Babylon also, though they appeared to their worshippers only in dreams and visions, were conceived to be human in their bodily shape, human in their passions, and human in their fate. For like men they were born into the world, and like men they loved and fought and died. Part II. Kings killed when their strength fails. If the high gods who dwell remote from the fret and fever of this earthly life are yet believed to die at last, it is not to be expected that a god who lodges in a frail tabernacle of flesh should escape the same fate, though we hear of African kings who have imagined themselves immortal by virtue of their sorceries. Now primitive peoples, as we have seen, sometimes believe that their safety, and even that of the world, is bound up with the life of one of these god men, or human incarnations of the divinity. Naturally, therefore, they take the utmost care of his life, out of a regard for their own. But no amount of care and precaution will prevent the man god from growing old and feeble, and at last dying. His worshippers have to lay their account with this sad necessity, and to meet it as best they can. The danger is a formidable one, for if the course of nature is dependent on the man god's life, what catastrophes may not be expected from the gradual enfeeblement of his powers and their final extinction in death? There is only one way of averting these dangers. The man god must be killed as soon as he shows symptoms that his powers are beginning to fail, and his soul must be transferred to a vigorous successor before it has been seriously impaired by the threatened decay. The advantages of thus putting the man god to death instead of allowing him to die of old age and disease are to the savage obvious enough. For if the man god dies what we call a natural death, it means, according to the savage, that his soul has either voluntarily departed from his body and refuses to return, or, more commonly, that it has been extracted, or at least detained in its wanderings, by a demon or sorcerer. In any of these cases the soul of the man god is lost to his worshippers, and with it their prosperity is gone and their very existence endangered. Even if they could arrange to catch the soul of the dying god as it left his lips or his nostrils, and so transfer it to a successor, this would not effect their purpose; for, dying of disease, his soul would necessarily leave his body in the last stage of weakness and exhaustion, and so enfeebled it would continue to drag out a languid inert existence in any body to which it might be transferred. Whereas by slaying him his worshippers could, in the first place, make sure of catching his soul as it escaped and transferring it to a suitable successor; and in the second place, by putting him to death before his natural force was abated, they would secure that the world should not fall into decay with the decay of the man god. Every purpose therefore was answered, and all dangers averted, by thus killing the man god and transferring his soul, while yet at its prime, to a vigorous successor. The mystic kings of fire and water in Cambodia are not allowed to die a natural death. Hence, when one of them is seriously ill, and the elders think that he cannot recover, they stab him to death. The people of Congo believed, as we have seen, that if their pontiff, the Chitomé, were to die a natural death, the world would perish, and the earth, which he alone sustained by his power and merit, would immediately be annihilated. Accordingly, when he fell ill and seemed likely to die, the man who was destined to be his successor entered the pontiff's house with a rope or a club, and strangled or clubbed him to death. The Ethiopian kings of Meroe were worshipped as gods, but whenever the priests chose, they sent a messenger to the king ordering him to die, and alleging an oracle of the gods as their authority for the command. This command the kings always obeyed, down to the reign of Ergamenes, a contemporary of Ptolemy II, king of Egypt. Having received a Greek education, which emancipated him from the superstitions of his countrymen, Ergamenes ventured to disregard the command of the priests, and entering the golden temple with a body of soldiers, put the priests to the sword. Customs of the same sort appear to have prevailed in this part of Africa down to modern times. In some tribes of Fazokh the king had to administer justice daily under a certain tree. If from sickness or any other cause he was unable to discharge this duty for 3 whole days, he was hanged on the tree in a noose, which contained 2 razors so arranged that when the noose was drawn tight by the weight of the king's body they cut his throat. A custom of putting their divine kings to death at the first symptoms of infirmity or old age prevailed until lately, if indeed it is even now extinct and not merely dormant, among the Shilluk of the White Nile, and in recent years it has been carefully investigated by Dr. C.G. Seligman. The reverence which the Shilluk pay to their king appears to arise chiefly from the conviction that he is a reincarnation of the spirit of Nyakang, the semi divine hero who founded the dynasty and settled the tribe in their present territory. It is a fundamental article of the Shilluk creed that the spirit of the divine or semi divine Nyakang is incarnate in the reigning king, who is accordingly himself invested to some extent with the character of a divinity. But while the Shilluk hold their kings in high, indeed religious reverence, and take every precaution against their accidental death, nevertheless they cherish the conviction that the king must not be allowed to become ill or senile, lest, with his diminishing vigour, the cattle should sicken and fail to bear their increase, the crops should rot in the fields, and man, stricken with disease, should die in ever increasing numbers. To prevent these calamities it used to be the regular custom with the Shilluk to put the king to death whenever he showed signs of ill health or failing strength. One of the fatal symptoms of decay was taken to be an incapacity to satisfy the sexual passions of his wives, of whom he has very many, distributed in a large number of houses at Fashoda. When this ominous weakness manifested itself, the wives reported it to the chiefs, who are popularly said to have intimated to the king his doom by spreading a white cloth over his face and knees as he lay slumbering in the heat of the sultry afternoon. Execution soon followed the sentence of death. A hut was specially built for the occasion. The king was led into it, and lay down with his head resting on the lap of a nubile virgin. The door of the hut was then walled up, and the couple were left without food, water, or fire, to die of hunger and suffocation. This was the old custom, but it was abolished some 5 generations ago on account of the excessive sufferings of one of the kings who perished in this way. It is said that the chiefs announce his fate to the king, and that afterwards he is strangled in a hut which has been specially built for the occasion. From Dr. Seligman's inquiries it appears that not only was the Shilluk king liable to be killed with due ceremony at the first symptoms of incipient decay, but even while he was yet in the prime of health and strength he might be attacked at any time by a rival, and have to defend his crown in a combat to the death. According to the common Shilluk tradition, any son of a king had the right thus to fight the king in possession, and if he succeeded in killing him, to reign in his stead. As every king had a large harem and many sons, the number of possible candidates for the throne at any time may well have been not inconsiderable, and the reigning monarch must have carried his life in his hand. But the attack on him could only take place, with any prospect of success, at night, for during the day the king surrounded himself with his friends and bodyguards, and an aspirant to the throne could hardly hope to cut his way through them and strike home. It was otherwise at night. For then the guards were dismissed, and the king was alone in his enclosure.